The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Colonel David Rosen stepped out of the black diplomatic car. He adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform and took a deep breath of the crisp London air. After 20 years of service in the Israeli Defense Forces, he had seen his share of important meetings, but this was different. This was Buckingham Palace. Rosen had earned his reputation the hard way. Growing up in a small town outside Tel Aviv, he had always dreamed of serving his country. His father had been a soldier, and his grandfather before him. Military service wasn't just a job for David, it was in his blood. He had worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect from his men and recognition from his superiors through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. The delegation he was part of had been months in the planning. Israeli and British military officials were meeting to discuss joint security operations, intelligence sharing, and counter-terrorism strategies. It was the kind of high-level cooperation that happened behind closed doors, away from the public eye. David felt honored to be chosen for such an important mission. As he walked through the palace entrance, David couldn't help but be impressed by the grandeur around him. The walls were lined with portraits of kings and queens, their eyes seemingly following visitors as they passed. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, and every surface seemed to gleam with polish and care. It was like stepping into a history book. A British aide approached him with a polite smile. "Colonel Rosen, welcome to Buckingham Palace. I'm Lieutenant Thompson, and I'll be your liaison during your stay." The young officer spoke with the crisp accent that David had only heard in movies. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'm honored to be here," David replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. He had always believed that a strong handshake showed character, and first impressions mattered. Thompson led him through a series of corridors, each more impressive than the last. They passed rooms filled with priceless artwork and furniture that had witnessed centuries of history. David found himself wondering what decisions had been made in these very halls, what conversations had shaped the course of nations. "The main meetings will begin tomorrow morning," Thompson explained as they walked. "But tonight there's a state dinner being prepared for the visiting delegations. We thought it would be appropriate for you to observe some of our security protocols firsthand." David nodded approvingly. He appreciated practical learning over theoretical discussions. In his experience, you could learn more about a military operation by watching it in action than by reading a dozen reports. They arrived at a large hall where preparations for the evening were already underway. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency, setting up tables, arranging flowers, and checking every detail. But what caught David's attention were the guards. The royal guards stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. David had seen them in photographs and tourist videos, but seeing them in person was different. They stood perfectly still, their faces expressionless, their posture flawless. To most observers, they looked like living statues, part of the palace's decoration rather than actual soldiers. "Impressive, aren't they?" Thompson said, noticing David's gaze. "These men represent centuries of tradition and excellence." David studied them with his trained military eye. He could see the discipline in their bearing, but something bothered him. The formations seemed overly ceremonial, focused more on appearance than tactical effectiveness. The positions they held looked more suitable for a parade than actual security work. "They certainly look the part," David replied diplomatically, though privately he had his doubts about the practical value of such elaborate ceremony. Thompson continued the tour, explaining various aspects of palace security and protocol. David listened politely, but his attention kept returning to the guards. In his mind, he was already analyzing their positions, thinking about how he would improve their effectiveness if given the chance. "Colonel Rosen," Thompson said as they concluded the tour, "I have some excellent news. Given your extensive experience in security operations, our commanders thought it would be valuable for you to have temporary oversight of tonight's ceremonial guard detail." David's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Oversight?" "Yes, sir. Nothing too complex, just ensuring everything runs smoothly during the dinner preparations. Consider it a cultural exchange of military expertise." David felt a surge of pride. Being trusted with any role in palace security Even a ceremonial one was clearly a sign of respect for his abilities and his country's military reputation. This was an opportunity to show British military officials what Israeli efficiency looked like. "I'm honored by the trust you're placing in me," David said, straightening his shoulders. "When do I begin?" "Right away, if you're ready." "The evening. Preparations are quite extensive, and having your experienced eye overseeing things would be most appreciated." As Thompson led him back to where the guards were stationed, David's mind was already working. He had spent years optimizing military operations, finding ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness. The elaborate ceremonies he had witnessed seemed to prioritize tradition over practicality, and he was confident he could suggest improvements that would benefit everyone involved. The guards maintained their positions as David approached, their eyes fixed straight ahead. He walked among them, noting their spacing, their sight lines, and their tactical positioning. From a purely military perspective, there were obvious improvements that could be made. "Gentlemen," David announced, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of command experience, "I'll be overseeing tonight's operations. I've observed your current formations, and I believe we can make some adjustments that will improve both efficiency and security." The guards remained motionless, their training keeping them in position regardless of the unexpected development. David interpreted their silence as professional acknowledgement of his authority. Thompson, who had been speaking with another officer nearby, turned back toward David with a slightly puzzled expression. "Colonel, perhaps I should clarify the nature of the oversight role." But David was already focused on the task at hand. He had been given responsibility, and he intended to fulfill it to the best of his abilities. In his experience, when you were put in charge of something, you took charge completely. Half measures and uncertain leadership were recipes for failure. "Lieutenant, I appreciate the briefing, but I think it's best if I assess the situation directly," David said confidently. "I've seen what needs to be done, and these men deserve leadership that will help them perform at their highest level." As the afternoon wore on, David threw himself into his new role with characteristic intensity. He studied every aspect of the guard detail, making mental notes about improvements that could be implemented. The evening's state dinner would be his opportunity to demonstrate that Israeli military expertise could enhance even the most traditional British operations. What David didn't realize was that his interpretation of oversight was quite different from what had been intended. The role was meant to be largely observational, a gesture of respect and cultural exchange rather than active command. But David, accustomed to taking charge and making improvements wherever he found inefficiency, was already planning changes that he believed would benefit everyone involved. The stage was set for an evening that would test not just military protocols, but the delicate balance of international diplomacy and cultural understanding. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade as Colonel David Rosen watched the Royal Guards maintain their positions in the Grand Hall. He had been observing them for over an hour now, and his military mind was working overtime. These men were clearly disciplined, but their formation seemed all wrong for actual security work. David pulled out a small notebook and began sketching the current layout. In his 20 years of service, he had learned that the best way to improve any operation was to first understand what you were working with. The guards stood in traditional ceremonial positions that looked impressive, but left obvious gaps in coverage. "Sergeant," David called out to the nearest guard, a tall man with graying temples visible beneath his iconic bearskin hat. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, not acknowledging the call. David frowned. He understood military discipline, but when a superior officer called, you responded. He walked closer and spoke more firmly. "Sergeant, I need to speak with you about repositioning your men." Still no response. The guard stood like a statue, his breathing so controlled it was barely visible. David felt a flicker of irritation. He had dealt with stubborn soldiers before, but this level of non-responsiveness seemed excessive. Lieutenant Thompson appeared at David's elbow, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Colonel, perhaps I should mention that the guards have specific protocols about maintaining their positions during ceremonial duties." "I understand protocols, Lieutenant," David replied, his voice showing the first signs of impatience. "But I've been put in charge of tonight's security arrangements, and I can see several areas where improvements are needed." David turned back to address the guards as a group. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Gentlemen, I need you to adjust your spacing. The current formation leaves the eastern entrance poorly covered, and your sight lines are blocked by these decorative columns." The guards remained motionless. David could see their eyes, and while they clearly heard him, none of them moved so much as an inch. In his experience, good soldiers followed orders promptly, especially when those orders made tactical sense. "I know change can be difficult," David continued, his tone becoming more firm. "But military effectiveness requires adaptability. We're going to modify this formation to provide better coverage and more efficient positioning." A few palace staff members had stopped their dinner preparations to watch what was unfolding. David noticed their attention but interpreted it as professional interest in seeing military efficiency in action. Thompson cleared his throat nervously. "Colonel Rosen, perhaps we should discuss." "Lieutenant, I appreciate your concern, but I have this handled," David interrupted. He had been given authority over this detail, and he intended to use it properly. In his mind, halfway leadership was worse than no leadership at all. David approached the senior guardsman, a man whose medals and bearing clearly indicated years of service. "Sergeant Major, I'm ordering a tactical repositioning of your men. Please have them move to the positions I'm about to indicate." The guardsman's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, but he remained at attention. David had seen enough stubborn, non-commissioned officers in his career to recognize the signs. Sometimes, you had to be more direct with experienced soldiers who were set in their ways. "I understand you've been doing things a certain way for a long time," David said, his voice rising slightly so other guards could hear. "But I'm here to help you improve your effectiveness." Real soldiers adapt to new situations and follow orders from their commanding officers. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several palace staff members had now stopped working entirely, and David could feel the weight of their attention. He knew that sometimes leadership required making tough decisions in front of others, even when it was uncomfortable. "The formation you're currently using might look impressive for tourists," David continued, his frustration finally showing through. "But it's tactically unsound. Any security professional can see the weaknesses. I'm not asking for your opinion, I'm giving you a direct order." The senior guardsman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he still didn't move. David had reached his limit. In every military organization he had ever served in, direct insubordination had consequences, regardless of rank or experience. "Sergeant Major," David said loudly, his voice echoing off the ornate walls, "your refusal to follow orders is unacceptable. I don't care how long you've been doing this job or how many ceremonies you've participated in. When a superior officer gives you an order, you follow it." The hall had grown quiet except for David's voice. Even the staff members arranging flowers had stopped their work to listen. David felt the eyes of everyone in the room, but he was committed now. Leadership sometimes required difficult moments, and backing down would undermine his authority completely. "This is exactly the kind of rigid thinking that makes military operations inefficient," David declared, addressing not just the guards but everyone within earshot. "You're so focused on maintaining traditions that you've forgotten the actual purpose of military service. Real soldiers put mission effectiveness above ceremonial appearances." Thompson looked pale and kept glancing toward the doorway as if expecting someone to arrive. Other British officers who had been reviewing dinner arrangements were now standing perfectly still, their conversations abandoned. David pointed to specific positions around the hall. "I want 3 men moved to cover the northern entrances, 2 repositioned to improve sight lines on the main floor, and the remaining guards spread more evenly to eliminate the current blind spots. This isn't a suggestion, it's an order." When the guards still didn't move, David's military training took over completely. He had dealt with insubordination before, and he knew that allowing it to continue would destroy any chance of effective leadership. "Sergeant Major, step forward," David commanded, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. When the guardsman didn't move, David's patience finally snapped entirely. "I said step forward. In every military organization I've ever served in, when an officer gives you a direct order, you follow it immediately. Your behavior is a disgrace to the uniform you're wearing and an insult to military discipline everywhere." The words echoed through the grand hall, and David could see the shock on the faces of the British staff members, but he was past the point of diplomatic niceties. Sometimes leadership required taking a firm stand, regardless of the consequences. "You may think your fancy uniforms and ceremonial duties make you special," David continued, his voice rising with each word. "But at the end of the day, you're soldiers, and soldiers follow orders. If you can't handle that basic responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't be wearing those uniforms at all." The silence that followed was deafening. David stood in the center of the hall, breathing heavily from the intensity of his speech, surrounded by motionless guards and stunned palace staff. He had made his point, established his authority, and laid down the law about military discipline. What he didn't realize was that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenging not just individual soldiers but centuries of tradition and protocol in one of the most sacred spaces of British military heritage. The consequences of his words were already beginning to unfold around him, though he wouldn't understand their full impact for several more minutes. The silence in the grand hall was unlike anything Colonel David Rosen had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of soldiers at attention, or the focused silence of a briefing room. This was something else entirely. A heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press down on him from all sides. David stood in the center of the ornate hall, his chest still rising and falling from the intensity of his speech. He had said what needed to be said, established his authority, and made his expectations clear. In his mind, this was how leadership worked. You identified problems, you addressed them directly, and you moved forward with solutions. But something felt wrong. The palace staff members who had been preparing for the evening's dinner were no longer working. They stood frozen in place, some holding flower arrangements, others clutching polishing cloths, all of them staring at David with expressions he couldn't quite read. It wasn't admiration for strong leadership. It wasn't the respect he usually earned after taking charge of a difficult situation. It was something closer to horror. Lieutenant Thompson's face had gone completely pale. The young British officer kept glancing between David and the motionless guards, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. His hands were trembling slightly, and David noticed a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the hall. David began to feel the first stirrings of doubt. In his 20 years of military service, he had given hundreds of speeches, issued thousands of orders, and dealt with countless situations involving discipline and leadership. He knew what success looked like, and this wasn't it. The royal guards remained perfectly still, but David was beginning to notice details he had missed before. The senior guardsman's jaw was clenched so tightly that muscles stood out along his neck. Another guard's hands were positioned in a way that suggested he was fighting every instinct to respond. Their eyes, which David had interpreted as defiant or stubborn, now seemed to hold something else entirely. It was restraint. Professional, disciplined restraint of the highest order. A new voice cut through the silence, calm and measured, but carrying unmistakable authority. "Colonel Rosen." David turned to see a tall British officer approaching from the main entrance. The man wore the uniform of a general, his bearing speaking of decades of command experience. His face was composed, but David could see controlled anger in his eyes. "General Morrison," Thompson said quickly, snapping to attention with obvious relief. General Morrison nodded briefly to Thompson but kept his focus on David. "Colonel Rosen, I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about your role here this evening." David straightened his shoulders, prepared to explain his actions. "General, I was given oversight of the guard detail, and I was implementing some tactical improvements." "Colonel," the general interrupted gently but firmly. "Please walk with me. It wasn't a request." David found himself following the general toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the staff and guards. As they walked, David's confidence began to waver. Something in the general's manner suggested that he was about to learn something important, something that would change his understanding of the entire situation. "Colonel Rosen," General Morrison began, his voice carefully controlled. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What do you know about the military background of the men you've been addressing? David blinked, confused by the question. I assumed they were ceremonial guards, sir. Traditional positions, mostly for show and tourist attractions. That's why. I was trying to improve their tactical effectiveness. The general closed his eyes briefly as if gathering patience. Colonel, the man you just publicly dressed down, Sergeant Major Williams, served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions under fire that saved the lives of 12 civilians and 6 of his fellow soldiers. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. The guard to his left, the general continued. Corporal Jenkins is a veteran of operations in Iraq and Syria. He has more combat experience than most officers will see in their entire careers. The youngest man in that formation has completed 2 deployments and earned commendations for bravery under fire. Each word hit David like a physical blow. He looked back at the guards, seeing them with completely different eyes. These weren't ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. These were combat veterans, decorated warriors who had earned their positions through service and sacrifice. But sir, David said weakly, their formations, the ceremonial aspects. Colonel, General Morrison said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, do you believe that ceremonial duties are incompatible with combat effectiveness? Do you think a soldier becomes less capable because he also serves in traditions that date back centuries? David's mouth went dry. No, sir, I didn't mean. These men, the general continued, maintain standards of discipline and precision that are among the highest in the world. The formations you dismissed as ineffective are the result of centuries of refinement. Every position, every movement, every protocol has been tested and perfected through generations of service. The reality of what David had done was beginning to crash down on him like a collapsing building. He had questioned the competence of decorated combat veterans. He had insulted men who had risked their lives for their country. He had dismissed as worthless traditions that represented centuries of military excellence. The rigid thinking you criticized, General Morrison went on, is actually a form of discipline that most militaries can only aspire to achieve. These men can stand motionless for hours, not because they're inflexible, but because they have developed a level of self-control that borders on superhuman. David looked back at Sergeant Major Williams, the senior guardsman he had publicly humiliated. The man's service record was probably more impressive than David's own. Yet David had treated him like a raw recruit who didn't understand basic military principles. Sir, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I thought I was helping. Colonel, these men heard every word you said. They absorbed your criticism, your questioning of their professionalism, your suggestion that they weren't real soldiers. And do you know what they did? David shook his head, afraid to hear the answer. They maintained their posts. They followed their orders to remain at attention during ceremonial preparations. They demonstrated the exact kind of military discipline that you claimed they lacked. David felt sick. Every word he had spoken, every criticism he had leveled, every assumption he had made, all of it had been wrong. Worse than wrong, it had been insulting to men who deserved his respect, not his condescension. The oversight role you were given, General Morrison explained, was meant to be observational, a cultural exchange, an opportunity for you to witness our traditions and perhaps share some insights about Israeli military practices. It was never intended as operational command. David realized that his mistake went beyond military protocol. He had misunderstood not just his role, but the entire nature of what he was witnessing. His expertise in Israeli military operations didn't automatically qualify him to improve British military traditions that had been developed and refined over centuries. What do I do now? David asked, the weight of his error crushing down on him. General Morrison looked at him with something that might have been sympathy mixed with disappointment. Now, Colonel, you learned something that every good officer must eventually understand. That true military leadership sometimes means recognizing when you've made a mistake, accepting responsibility for it, and finding a way to make things right. David nodded slowly, understanding that his education in military leadership was far from complete, and that the most important lesson of his career was just beginning. The next morning came too soon for Colonel David Rosen. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of his hotel room, replaying every moment of what had happened at Buckingham Palace. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the royal guards, heard his own voice echoing through that grand hall, felt the weight of General Morrison's words settling on his shoulders like a heavy stone. David's phone had been buzzing since dawn. First, it was Lieutenant Thompson, speaking in clipped professional tones about schedule changes. Then came a call from his own commanding officer back in Israel, Colonel Ben David, whose voice carried a coldness that David had never heard before. "David, we need to talk," Ben David had said. "I'm flying to London. We'll meet this afternoon." That was all. No explanation, no details, but David knew. Word had already reached Tel Aviv. In the age of instant communication and diplomatic channels, bad news traveled faster than good news, and this was very bad news indeed. David sat in the hotel restaurant, pushing eggs around his plate without eating. Other guests chatted quietly at nearby tables, reading newspapers, discussing their plans for the day. None of them knew that the man sitting alone by the window had potentially damaged relations between two allied nations with a single afternoon of misplaced confidence. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from his wife, Rachel. "Saw the news. Are you okay? Call me when you can." David's heart sank. If Rachel had seen news reports, then the story had already gone public. He quickly searched for news about the incident on his phone, and what he found made his stomach turn. The headlines were diplomatic in their language, but the message was clear. "Cultural tensions arise during military talks," read one. "Diplomatic incident at palace during Israeli visit," announced another. The articles were carefully worded, avoiding direct criticism, but they all mentioned misunderstandings about protocol and sensitivity regarding military traditions. David realized that reporters had been present during the dinner preparations. Palace staff talked to journalists. Word spread through social media and diplomatic circles. What had started as his private mistake was now becoming an international incident. By noon, David found himself sitting in a conference room at the Israeli embassy in London. The walls were decorated with photographs of Israeli leaders and British-Israeli cooperation over the years. Under normal circumstances, David would have felt proud to be in such a room. Today, it felt like a courtroom. Colonel Ben David arrived, exactly on time, accompanied by the Israeli military attaché to the UK, and a diplomat David didn't recognize. Ben David's expression was unreadable, but David had served under him long enough to recognize the signs of barely controlled anger. "David," Ben David said without preamble, "explain to me how one of my best officers managed to create a diplomatic crisis in less than 2 hours." David had prepared for this moment, but actually facing his commanding officer made everything harder. "Sir, I misunderstood my role. I thought I was supposed to provide operational oversight, and I made assumptions about the capabilities and background of the British Guards." "Assumptions," the diplomat repeated, speaking for the first time. "Colonel Rosen, do you understand that your assumptions have been the subject of 3 separate phone calls between our Prime Minister and the British government?" David felt the blood drain from his face. The Prime Minister knew about this. The incident had reached the highest levels of government in both countries. "The British have been extremely diplomatic about this," Ben David continued, "but their patience has limits. General Morrison spoke with me for an hour this morning, explaining what happened and what it means for our ongoing military cooperation agreements." The military attaché, a veteran diplomat named Colonel Weiss, opened a folder on the table. "David, I've been managing Israeli-British military relations for 8 years. We've built trust slowly, carefully, through dozens of successful joint operations and exchanges. That trust took years to establish." David knew what was coming next. "In one afternoon," Weiss continued, "you've damaged relationships that people have spent their careers building. The British military establishment is close-knit, traditional, And they don't forget insults to their institutions or their people. Ben David leaned forward. The Royal Guard that you criticized? They're not just ceremonial soldiers, David. They're the public face of British military tradition. When you questioned their competence, you questioned centuries of British military heritage. I know that now, sir, David said quietly. I've learned about their service records, their combat experience. I was completely wrong. Yes, you were, the diplomat said bluntly. But knowledge after the fact doesn't repair the damage. The British press is already picking up the story. It's being framed as cultural insensitivity during important diplomatic talks. David's phone, which he had placed on silent, was lighting up with notifications, messages from colleagues, friends, even his mother. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, if he was all right, how bad things really were. What does this mean for my career? David asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Ben David and Weiss exchanged glances. David, you're a good officer, Ben David said finally. You've served with distinction for 20 years. But this isn't just about military discipline anymore. This is about diplomatic relations and international cooperation. The British have requested that you be removed from any future joint operations, Weiss added. They were polite about it, but the message was clear. Your presence would be a reminder of this incident. David felt as if the room was spinning. Joint operations with allies had been a major part of his career advancement. Without access to international assignments, his prospects for promotion were severely limited. There's more, Ben David continued. The defense minister wants to see you when you return to Israel. This has become a case study in what not to do during diplomatic missions. You'll likely be reassigned to a position where cultural sensitivity isn't a primary requirement. The words hit David like physical blows. A desk job. Training recruits perhaps, or logistics planning. Important work, but not the kind of leadership positions he had been working toward his entire career. The British have been gracious, the diplomat said, but they've made it clear that they expect a formal response from our government, an apology, an acknowledgement of the mistake, and assurances that this won't happen again. David understood that he would be the example, the cautionary tale told to future officers about the importance of cultural awareness and diplomatic sensitivity. His mistake would become part of military education curricula, a lesson in humility and respect for Allied traditions. I want to apologize, David said. To the guards, to General Morrison, to everyone I offended. That can be arranged, Weiss replied. But David, you need to understand that some damage can't be completely repaired. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. As the meeting concluded, David realized that his actions had consequences far beyond his own career. Other Israeli officers might find themselves facing additional scrutiny during international assignments. The carefully built relationships between Israeli and British military establishments would need time and effort to fully heal. Walking back to his hotel through the streets of London, David understood that he was returning to Israel as a different person than the one who had left. The confident colonel who had stepped out of that diplomatic car at Buckingham Palace was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the hardest lesson of his career about the price of arrogance and the importance of understanding before judging. 3 months had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, but for Colonel David Rosen, it felt like a lifetime. The flight back to Israel had been the longest of his life, filled with uncomfortable silences from his fellow delegation members, and the weight of knowing that his career would never be the same. The Defense Ministry building in Tel Aviv looked the same as always, but David felt like a stranger walking through its familiar corridors. Officers who had once greeted him warmly now offered polite nods and quick hellos before hurrying past. Word traveled fast in military circles, and everyone knew what had happened in London. David's new office was smaller than his previous one, tucked away in a corner of the training department. His title was still colonel, but his responsibilities had been drastically reduced. Instead of planning international operations and leading combat-ready units, he now oversaw classroom instruction for junior officers and reviewed training manuals that needed updating. It was important work, David told himself, but it wasn't the kind of leadership role he had spent 20 years building toward. Every morning when he sat at his desk, He was reminded of how quickly a career could change direction based on a single afternoon of poor judgment. The hardest part wasn't the demotion or the change in duties. It was the knowledge that his mistake had become a teaching tool. David had learned that his incident was now part of the curriculum at military academies, used as an example of what happens when cultural awareness fails during international assignments. Young cadets were studying his case, analyzing what went wrong, discussing how they would have handled the situation differently. David had become the cautionary tale that instructors used to emphasize the importance of humility and respect when working with Allied forces. His wife Rachel had been supportive, but David could see the disappointment in her eyes during quiet moments. She never said anything directly, but he knew she had been proud of his rising career, had looked forward to the opportunities and prestige that came with higher ranks and international assignments. Their teenage son, Aviv, had been confused at first about why his father was suddenly home more often and why certain family friends stopped calling. David had tried to explain without going into details, but teenagers were smart. Aviv had probably looked up the news reports online and figured out most of the story himself. The formal reprimand from the defense minister had been delivered in a closed-door meeting that lasted exactly 15 minutes. The minister had been professional but clear. David's actions had required extensive diplomatic efforts to repair, and while his previous service record prevented more severe punishment, his future assignments would be limited to domestic duties only. But it was the letter David had been writing and rewriting for weeks that occupied most of his thoughts. He had started it dozens of times, crumpled up countless drafts, and stared at blank pages for hours. How do you apologize for something that went so fundamentally wrong? How do you express regret to people you may never see again for damage that couldn't be completely undone? Finally, on a quiet Sunday evening, David sat down at his kitchen table with a simple piece of paper and wrote from his heart. The letter began, "To Sergeant Major Williams and the members of the Royal Guard whom I had the privilege to observe at Buckingham Palace." David had learned all their names from General Morrison, who had graciously provided them when David requested the opportunity to write a formal apology. David wrote about his assumptions, his cultural blindness, and his failure to recognize the honor he had been given in being allowed to witness their service. He acknowledged their combat records, their sacrifices, and the centuries of tradition they represented with such dignity. He didn't make excuses or try to explain away his behavior. Instead, he focused on what he had learned about the difference between military expertise and military wisdom. Expertise, he wrote, was knowing how to accomplish a mission. Wisdom was understanding when to speak and when to listen, when to lead and when to learn. The letter took David 3 hours to write, and when he finished, he felt emotionally drained, but somehow lighter. He sealed it in an envelope and addressed to General Morrison, asking him to forward it to the appropriate recipients. 2 weeks later, David received an unexpected response. It came through official diplomatic channels, forwarded by the Israeli military attaché in London. Sergeant Major Williams had written back, just a few lines on official letterhead. "Colonel Rosen," the letter read, "we appreciate your words and recognize the sincerity behind them. Every soldier makes mistakes. The measure of a man is how he learns from them. We wish you well in your continued service to your country." David read the letter 5 times, each reading bringing a mixture of relief and continued regret. The guards had shown him more grace than he probably deserved, but their professionalism extended even to forgiveness. The incident had also changed how David approached his new responsibilities. In his training classes, he began including sessions on cultural awareness and international cooperation. He shared his own story, not as an excuse but as a real-world example of how quickly misunderstandings could escalate. Young officers listened intently when David explained how assumptions could undermine even the best intentions. He taught them that respect for Allied forces wasn't just diplomatic courtesy, it was essential for effective military cooperation. One evening, David was approached by a young lieutenant after a training session. "Sir," the officer said, "I appreciate you sharing your experience. It takes courage to admit mistakes publicly." David smiled sadly. "Lieutenant, The courage would have been recognizing my limitations before I made the mistake. What I'm doing now is just responsibility. As months turned into a year, David began to find satisfaction in his new role. He wasn't commanding operations or traveling internationally, but he was helping shape the next generation of officers. His lessons on cultural sensitivity and humility were making a difference in how young soldiers prepared for international assignments. Rachel noticed the change in her husband gradually. The anger and frustration that had consumed him immediately after the incident began to fade, replaced by a quieter kind of purpose. David was still the same dedicated soldier, but he had learned lessons that made him a better teacher and, perhaps, a better person. The promotion opportunities that David had once pursued were no longer available to him, but he discovered that there were different kinds of success in military service. Training officers who would go on to represent Israel with honor and professionalism became its own reward. On quiet evenings, David sometimes wondered what his career might have looked like if he had shown more humility at Buckingham Palace. But he had learned to stop dwelling on what couldn't be changed and focus instead on what he could still accomplish. His story had become a cautionary tale, but David chose to see it as something more valuable, a reminder that true military leadership required not just tactical skill and command presence, but wisdom, humility, and respect for the traditions and capabilities of others. In the end, Colonel David Rosen's greatest lesson came not from his successes, but from his failure, and from learning to rebuild his purpose on a foundation of hard-earned humility.